G'day guys, I'm Totally Zoo and welcome back to Wirradale Zoo. So today we are continuing on our Aussie icon section of the zoo, and for this one we're going to be building a massive joint habitat for kangaroos, wallabies and emus, and we're also going to be creating a walkthrough section of this habitat so our guests can walk through it. That's obviously going to require a lot of moving pieces and a lot of work to try to make it all work cohesively together. And so we're going to be trying to work that out. And to begin with here, as you can see, we're laying out a really large area in the zoo to allow for that joint habitat. We need this to be large for several reasons. We need the animals to be able to hide from the guests if they need to. We also need the smaller animals like the wallabies to have a space where they can seek sanctuary away from the larger emus and kangaroos as well. And of course, I tend to build quite large habitats anyway, so I don't need much of an excuse, but of course in this case, it really should be quite large anyway. As you can see, we're building this on a bit of a hill. Obviously the panda habitat is right next door and that's already on the top of a hill, so we need to match that elevation there as well. But I think it does tend to look really nice to be able to walk over the crest of that hill, and then you can look down and around and see the whole habitat from the top, as well as get a little bit of an overview of the other Australian species that we have down the hill, the cassowary and the crocodile. Now, one thing that I really wanted to be able to have with this habitat is the ability for the guests to feed the animals. So this is something that I've seen multiple times in real life, going to Australian native animal sanctuaries where you can buy little packets of pellets and things and you can feed the emus, wallabies, kangaroos. You can feed them straight out of your hands. And that's a really cool experience and definitely something that I want in this zoo. So obviously that's not something that actually exists in terms of the game mechanics, but we're going to try to hint that that's something that's happening here. So I looked at a few of the different food stands available and this was the one that seemed close-ish. The chips, as we'd call them in Australia, I think most people would call them fries. It looks like a little bag of things, and if you kind of squint your eyes and ignore exactly what it is, you might imagine that it's a bag of pellets and things there. So we're going to be using that. There'll be a stand for them to buy these right next to the entrance to the habitat, which I just think will look really nice and add a bit of detail to the zoo. So we're just going to be doing some really basic barriers for this one. We want the normal basic mesh fencing here. Sometimes it's really worth adding some custom barriers, particularly when you want that to be a standout part of the habitat, or if you want to fit a certain theme and the basic options don't fit that. But in this case, I want it to really be something that just blends into the background. We want the focal point of this to be the habitat itself and the species, so these will just fade into the background. Once we've got that laid out, I'm just going to be laying down a little bit of a watering hole down here. In some habitats you don't want to have a huge watering area, but given the size of this one, we want to have some variety of options for the animals, so a few regular troughs to drink from, but also something that they can bathe in if it's particularly hot as well. Particularly given that the emus have the waterfall enrichment item, I wanted to have a fitting area for that to go in because I think it looks really cool when they actually interact with that. So now we've got the main structure of the habitat done in terms of all the terraforming, we can start laying out the guest entrance. So if you're wondering how we're going to be doing that, we are not going to use the normal guest gates that you can do to let them walk through a habitat. All we're going to be doing is simply having our path go directly through the habitat, and the guests will just phase through the custom gates that we build. So the benefit of that is that we can build custom gates that look really nice. The drawback is, of course, that the guests just phase through it, so it looks a little silly when they're entering and exiting, but I think it works a lot better in the grand scheme of things. It also means that the guests will keep to the path that we've laid out, so we don't have to worry too much about them wandering around and getting into places that are a little bit silly, which you kind of have to live with if you do let your guests wander off of the path when you build with the actual habitat gates. So for the entrance, we're going for a nice rustic theme here. This is based off a pair of doors that I saw when I was out and about in real life, and I thought these look really cool. I wanted to recreate them in the zoo. So that harks back to, I think, the very first building tip I gave on the channel, which is to try to be inspired by things you see in real life, and you don't have to directly recreate them like I do here, but at least use that to create some inspiration for what you want to build in your zoos. So I thought these looked great, and it feels really satisfying when you feel like you've accurately recreated what you saw. So we've got these doors, playing around with a whole bunch of different colors until I feel like I'm satisfied with that. And then just surrounding that with a wooden frame there. This will be part of an airlock system that they use for guest entrances in habitats, of course. So basically there are 2 doors, and there'll be some kind of motorized thing that locks up one of the doors when one set is open. So you can only have one set open at a time, which will prevent the animals from being able to easily escape. So we're just going to take a little quick break here from the entrance and make sure that the overall aesthetic of the habitat is the way that I want it to be. So I always have a decent idea as to what I want it to look like, but you're never 100% sure. And when you start actually building it, sometimes you can realize that some things work better than you expect, some things don't work quite the same way you do, and potentially the idea I have in mind for that entrance won't work quite as well once I scrap a couple ideas or enhance a few of them. So I want to just make sure that the overall thing is all going the way I intend. So the main thing here is the big trees, but then we need to have a look at the bushes and other things around the habitat. So we're using the marula trees to create a nice bush by basically burying most of the trees so only the leaves are available above the ground, and also some of the wattle bushes as well. So this creates a really nice Australian bush appearance, which is exactly the type of thing you see in these type of large mixed species habitats in Australia, so something that I quite liked. And then we could get to work laying out the terrain paint across the habitat. So this is something that I had a really good idea as to what I wanted it to look like, having seen plenty of the Australian bush. And once I had most of that laid out, we then go back and make sure that the guest path looks the way that I need it to as well. And from there we could get back to working on the entrance itself, knowing what the overall aesthetic for the habitat would look like. For some reason I had these mesh fences still there on the edges of this, even though I knew that I was going to be removing them. I really should have just got rid of them, but regardless, what we're doing here is a high effort idea, which is just having these long planks, having a good mix of different plank lengths and things, and then we can basically individually color each plank to give it a bit more of a rustic aesthetic. You can tell that some of these planks are a bit weather worn, some of them aren't necessarily exactly the same, and it just adds a little bit of detail, although it creates a lot of work to do. But a concept we've talked about a few times, so I can reuse this elsewhere in the zoo whenever I need it from here. And that's something we're going to do straight away, because I want to have an indoor area for the wallabies so they can hide away from the other species if and when they need to. So we're going to be creating a little shack over here with a low entrance that the wallabies will be able to access. Yes, of course, the kangaroos will also be able to get in there if they really want, but they'll basically not be bothered for the most part. So we can have the wallabies have a nice little safety area over here. Now, of course, even though I've copied and pasted, there is a lot of effort, as you can see, little bits of plank sticking out and modifying things piece by piece. The main bit of added work for this was creating the entrance hole for the wallabies themselves. So the main work there was moving around the planks small amounts so that we didn't have straight lines visible through the wall. So once I'd shifted them little bits at a time, we could then add in the thicker wood as the barrier to sort of hold it all in place. And to my surprise, the wallabies could actually pathfind through this hole straight away. I didn't need to tweak it at all. So that was great. The wallabies could go straight through and the other kangaroo and emus couldn't. So I actually eyeballed this one perfectly from the get-go. So from there, I wanted to continue adding more details. As you can see, I already had our species in the habitat, but we needed to add more little bits of details like rocks and shrubs and bushes and things. So while I'm doing that, we obviously have red kangaroos in the game. Probably ideally we'd be talking about grey kangaroos in this type of a walkthrough habitat. Red kangaroos can be a little bit more aggressive. Probably what we're assuming with this is that our male red kangaroo was chosen for its very amenable nature. It's not going to be a particularly aggressive red kangaroo. So is it slightly unrealistic? It's not necessarily. Certainly there are times in zoos where you will have walkthrough habitats with the red kangaroos, but it might be slightly more normal to see them with the greys. So It's not the end of the world with this, it's certainly not something that is unheard of, but I do feel it's worth at least commenting on from my perspective that yeah, it's maybe a little bit different, but it's certainly not unheard of. So I wanted to add a rustic corrugated iron roofing for these things, and of course for some reason these corrugated iron sheets don't actually blend well with themselves, so you end up with these harsh lines across it. It's not too terrible. If you're looking for it, you can see it and it stands out a bit, but usually you're not going to be seeing it too easily. But I really didn't love it. I had to live with it basically because I couldn't use the 4x4 roofing segments. They're way too big and clunky for this, so we had to basically live with this. These are the small little compromises that I'm always finding myself making because the freedom of building in this game is not 100% perfect, hence why we talked about the wish list for Planet Zoo 2 last week. And speaking of which, I did mention that one of the huge things I wanted to see was improvements for the game's performance, and that is going to lead us nicely into the building tip for today. Okay, so today's building tip is not directly about building, but it's going to assist in the building process. So we're going to be looking at ways to reduce lag in your zoo. So a couple of these tips will mainly apply to sandbox mode, but there are some workarounds that can work in other modes as well. So the first tip we're going to look at is really basic. If we go into our settings and into sandbox and guest settings, you can restrict the number of guests to 1,000 or to 500 or to whatever you need it to be, and that's going to reduce the calculations the computer has to do. It doesn't have to figure out, you know, which guests are thirsty, which guests need to have a rest, which guests want to go in a certain direction, and so on and so on. So reducing that is really nice, particularly in sandbox mode when you don't need to worry about the money. Another one in a very similar vein is reducing the number of animals in your zoo. So the way you can do that is by basically just putting your animals into the animal storage. So you just hold them there indefinitely, and it's not going to be noticeable unless you're working in that area. So right now, I could easily move my pronghorn, bison, and coyotes and prairie dogs over into the animal storage, and I wouldn't really notice until I was in that area again. So that's a good way to reduce the lag. Wirradale Zoo is not really massive just yet. It could be a lot bigger in the long run. But if I look at my zoo animal list, you can already see I've got quite a lot of animals here. So if we could reduce that slightly, that would save a bit of lag as well. So another trick, and this is one you can do in challenge mode or in franchise mode as well, is just looking at the climbable surface in the zoo. So if we look at my cassowary habitat, we can see that climbing is all disabled, and that's going to prevent any unnecessary calculations for the computer. Given that we have huge numbers of different pieces in these habitats, if we have a few hundred less pieces that are climbable, that's just going to be a large reduction in calculations. So in this one, I haven't yet reduced that. So if we disable the climbing on all of those guys, that's going to save us a lot of strife. The important thing there is that you should be doing this as you go. You don't want to be doing this all in one go. So theoretically, I could select all of these things and disable the climbing in it. The issue is we have our panda habitat here and our red panda habitat here, and we actually want climbing to be enabled in both of those. So it's not as straightforward as just grabbing it all. So you want to do it bit by bit, and then you can pick and choose as you go. Of course, these are just a few ways to reduce your lag. You can do other things like reducing your graphics settings, but of course, like we've said, this will have a minimal impact on your gameplay, particularly if you're on sandbox mode. So those are some tricks you can use, and hopefully allows you to get a little bit extra out of your zoo. Okay, so back to the habitat, we're going to just be building a fence here for the steeper part of the slope into the habitat so that any guests who need it can use the side rails to hold onto, and also just hopefully prevent the animals from getting too close to the entrance as well. And while we're working on this type of thing, we'll just build a little sign here to say, please keep to the path. Of course, the guests can't actually leave the path, but we keep banging on about the realism in this zoo. So this is one of those things that looks a lot nicer when it's actually there. So we definitely want to add that small detail. We'll also add a little bench for the guests to sit on if they need, and they can sit there and feed the animals, or they can just sit there for a little rest. And also just adding the exit as well for the habitat. And once we're done with that, we are more or less done with the habitat itself. So soon we'll jump into the cinematics. As always, if you do enjoy these videos, I release them weekly, so please consider subscribing. Either way, thank you for watching and have a good one.
All